YouTube and Facebook.
Great.
And I'm going to let everybody in. I'll start the music, let everybody in. Good evening. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to this Halloween Eve edition of the Veterans Breakfast Club. I am Todd DiPastino. I'm the Executive Director of the Veterans Breakfast Club. And tonight we welcome retired Air Force pilot General Paul Tibbets IV. The very cool conversation we're going to have tonight. But first, I know there are some people who haven't joined us in a while or haven't joined us at all. And I just want to introduce myself. I'm Todd DiPastino, the Executive Director of the Veterans Breakfast Club. We're a nonprofit based in Pittsburgh. We've been around for 17 years, and we simply kind of create platforms where veterans can share their stories with the public. And I know many of you have joined us in the past, and I love to see these familiar faces that I haven't seen very much of lately, like Mary Klepper with her new hair, and Beth Russell, it's good to see you. And Dave Seaver, I hear you have a new job, and I want you to talk about that. I just found that out. Jim Blackwell, thank you for joining us. And thanks to all of you. I see Paul Little. Very good. Thanks, Paul, for joining us. I just want to remind people that we have these in-person events. We have online events all the time. We're coming up upon a very busy season here. We'll have an event on Saturday in Greensburg, PA. Then we'll have one in downtown Pittsburgh on November 5th, and then we're in Philadelphia on November 8th. And but next Monday we'll be back with our Monday night at 7 p.m. program, Open Conversation. So if you have a subject that you'd like to discuss, if you have a question you'd like to pose, if you have a story you'd like to share, please do let us know, and we'll make sure that we get you on the agenda for Monday night at 7 p.m. And now I'm just going to throw it to Glenn. Glenn, thank you very much for hosting our Greatest Generation Live.
Yeah, it's a pleasure. Thanks very much. It's a pleasure to be here again. And I think I see all familiar faces, but just in case, Greatest Generation Live is most Thursday nights, except for those nights when Todd steals it from me for something else. And it's all things World War II. And tonight we're going to cover a little bit about World War II, but a lot more, an awful lot more. Before we get started, though, where is he? Colin Heaton. I wanted to just recognize Colin Heaton because it was Colin who introduced us to Paul Tibbets IV. Colin, thanks very much. How are you doing?
I'm doing fine, and I love it when a plan comes together.
Yes. Thank you for starting the ball rolling by the introduction a couple of months ago, as I recall. So for those of you who don't know Colin, he's been a longtime contributor to the Veterans Breakfast Club, and we thank him for his loyalty and all his suggestions. So Paul Tibbets IV, if that name sounds familiar to you, it should, because he is the grandson of Paul Tibbets, Paul Tibbets Jr., the man who dropped the atomic bomb on Hiroshima, is what he's well known for. His life actually is quite deeper than that and goes well before that event. And I think in working this program up, Paul and Colin to some extent, I think what's going to be really neat about this program is that Paul Tibbets IV, I'm just going to start calling you Paul, if that's okay, Paul.
Yes.
Is going to take us from his grandfather's role, originally flying B-17s in Europe in the early days of the 8th Air Force. In fact, the first mission was commanded by his grandfather, to his grandfather's role with the B-29 and obviously dropping the atomic bomb. Then we're going to pick up the story with Paul Tibbets IV, Paul's story, graduating from the Air Force Academy, then his career in the 8th Air Force and commanding the same 509th bomb group, but with much more higher level technology. So we're going to kind of go from dropping 500-pound bombs out of a 4-engine rickety plane, B-17, all the way to the B-2 and the incredible nuclear deterrence that Paul Tibbets has worked with. So without any further ado, is Russell Freeberg on tonight by chance, by the way? Todd, did you see Russell?
No, I don't see him.
No. Okay. Yeah. I'd like to recognize Russell whenever he's on. He's one of our World War II veterans that is on quite a bit, and we just really appreciate when he's available. So without any further ado, I'm going to ask Paul. Paul's presented developed just a great presentation in a PowerPoint that is going to take us through what I just talked about. Paul, before you start the PowerPoint, Paul, just give us a little bit of background about yourself. Air Force Academy, 1989, right? Okay.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks, Glenn. And Todd, thank you for having me today, and Glenn and Colin, of course, for making the introduction. So everyone, it's a pleasure to be with you, to this distinguished group, to be able to spend a few minutes with you today talking about stories that are very close to my heart, because it's about the man who I would consider to be certainly my hero, and whom I got to spend a good bit of time with, because he lived a very long life, passing away close to 93 years old. So he was around for quite a while. And then we'll talk a little bit about current day. Yeah, Glenn, I started at the Air Force Academy in 1989. Graduating as a second lieutenant, and retired in 2018. So 29 and a half years in the Air Force, flying bombers, mostly in 8th Air Force, actually. But I did, for those out there that are just a couple of minutes older than I am, I did spend some time in a command called SAC, if you've ever heard of that, Strategic Air Command. And one of the last folks within my generation, this time frame and since, that actually set nuclear alert in bombers, in my case, the B-1 bomber. And that transitioned to an incredible career after that, until I stepped off. And so, as I said, it was a great career, and I'm glad to be retired and doing some other things now. So it allows me to spend some time with y'all tonight too. So are we ready to get started?
You do look a little bit like Rock Hudson, because I remember that movie, Strategic Air Command.
That's right.
Oh.
That's right.
A great Cold War movie.
I appreciate that. We know it's not true, but thank you for saying that.
Please.
Glenn, that's fantastic.
Let's get started.
My slides up?
Yep.
Okay. Well, ladies and gentlemen, again, pleasure to be with you tonight. We'll credit Glenn with a little bit tonight with saying, hey, let's come up with a creative title. So you heard him say it. I'll explain a couple of things as we get started. First of all, these are some slides I pulled from previous tour at Air Force Global Strike Command. So at the top, you see sort of our three main missions: deter, assure, and strike. So we deter as long as we can. We assure our allies, our friends, our allies, in making sure that we're there to perform our mission every day. And then if deterrence fails or we have some need, then we go and strike, like we did recently in Midnight Hammer. And I'm going to talk about that tonight. At the bottom of the slide, you can see the assets that are part of this great command, Air Force Global Strike Command. And if you've never heard of it, I'm not doing a Global Strike Command speech tonight. But if you haven't heard of Global Strike, it is the successor to the command I just mentioned, Strategic Air Command. So we went about 20 years from the end of SAC until Global Strike stood up, and that's a whole nother story. So if you want to ask me about that in Q&A, we could probably talk about that a little bit, but that'll take some time. But the bottom line is we have a command that oversees two legs of our nuclear triad, as you can see at the bottom there. Of course, that's the 747, the National Airborne Command Post, the NAOC, that's used to survive an attack with senior leaders so we can continue to communicate. And then, of course, you have the ICBMs, and then our bombers, the B-52, the B-1, and the B-2. The last four pictures represent those two legs of our nuclear triad, the ICBM leg and the bomber leg. And as many of you are probably familiar, we also have a submarine launched ballistic missile leg, an SLBM leg. So that is the triad. Now we'll talk about nuclear deterrence towards the end of the presentation. But that's kind of a layout for the slides, just so you can kind of get a sense for what's going on there. Today I'm going to talk about the two generations, and then I'll get through my grandfather. I call it how it all began. And then a little bit about this leaping technology that Glenn kind of teased out with you. And then the importance of nuclear deterrence. And then this last bullet's really important to me. It's last because it's just that important, why we do what we do. And I'll leave it at that, but you'll see what I mean when I get there. So let's get started. First of all, one of my heroes from my time in the service, and actually the president I was entering in the Air Force, was President Ronald Reagan. And I love this quote, and I think it's very appropriate for this presentation tonight because this is exactly what we're talking about. That freedom really depends on each generation stepping up to the plate and making sure that we continue to protect it, right? We don't pass it on. It's not free. You know, when you're born, you don't get it automatically, right? It must be fought for, protected, and handed on for them to do the same. And I use this a lot when I speak to young people because many times it's this idea of there are those that have paid the price for our freedom, sometimes the ultimate price. And we will never forget them. But it takes each generation to step up to the plate, to serve this nation, to keep this going and continue to be the great country that we are. So my grandfather and me, so we have to start with this photo because it is definitely the best photo that I have of my grandfather and myself. This is actually in a B-29. We did fly it. This is Fifi, for those that are familiar with the Commemorative Air Force, the CAF. This is Fifi, one of two flying B-29s today. The other one is Doc, and you're going to see a picture of Doc here in just a second. I've flown in both. I was very fortunate because I do have this grandfather that you know about. So he introduced me to the CAF. He introduced me to this squadron, and we actually got to fly this airplane together. So I'm going to tell a very quick story, but the bottom line is that when this took place, we were at an air show in Midland, Texas, where the CAF headquarters used to be. It's now over near in Dallas, kind of East Dallas now, but it used to be in Midland, Texas. And we were at their annual air show, and he introduced me to the squadron, and I met some of the crew members, and they said, "Hey, would you like to go flying?" I'm absolutely. And they said, "Well, actually, we'd like you and your grandfather to go flying." I go, I knew there was a hook here. So I was like, "Yeah, great." And I said, "But I think you should know something. My grandfather told me that he doesn't fly anymore. His health. I mean, he's okay. He's in his mid 80s at this point, but his health's not great. It's difficult for him to get kind of into tight spaces. He doesn't hear very well. For any of you that ran across him later in his life, you know how his hearing was really, really bad. But I'm happy to talk to him." They go, "No, we'll talk to him." I said, "Okay." So went about my way. You can see I was a captain, if you can see my rank in that picture. So I'm a young whippersnapper thinking that, I'm all that, right? And it's all that's not true. Granddad was all that. So they went and asked him, and he said, "Well, no." And I said, "Well, I told you." And it just so happens my grandmother passed away a long time ago. And he had a friend with him, a lady friend, and she was there when they asked him. And later that night, she said, "Paul," my grandfather, Paul, "if you don't take this chance, you may never get to fly with your grandson again." And that changed the whole dynamic. Now, that was true. We never did fly together again. And we weren't together a lot, but we did see each other a good bit, and I'll speak to that later. But we got to fly for 20 minutes in this airplane. And when we landed, the crew, Granddad kind of scuttled off. He was doing a book signing and some other things, and the crew was talking to him. And they're like, "Hey, Paul, can we ask you a question?" I said, "Sure, yeah." They said, "Well, could you tell us about when you were flying? Did y'all both fly?" And I said, "Absolutely." So I talked to them about when my grandfather was flying and when I was flying. And they said, "Well, that's what we thought." And I thought, "What do you mean that's what you thought?" In my head, right? I wasn't rude about it. And they're like, "Well, your grandfather, it's like riding a bike, right? He hops in a B-29 and he's off and running again. Smooth, easy, everything's good. And when you were flying, yeah, not so much." And I said, "Well, I'm a bomber. I'm a B-1 pilot, a B-2 pilot, T-38 pilot. I don't know how to fly this, right?" It might have done a little bit of, uncoordinated flight when I was up there in the cockpit. Kind of funny. The controls that you use to fly this airplane with the rudder and the yoke are quite a bit different than flying a B-1 or a B-2. I'm sure you can appreciate that. So I laughed a little bit, and they're like, "No, we're serious." I go, "I got it. Okay, I'm not as good as my grandfather. We know that, right?" But as time goes on, I was able to actually get into another airplane, the B-29 Doc. And so I want to show you, hang on one second. I don't know why. There it goes. And Doc is the second of the two. And I'm just going to play this for you real quick. This is just because it sounds cool. They let me actually fly the airplane. The guy in the left seat, the captain, is a good friend of mine who flew tankers in the air. So if I look scared, it's because, well, I am. Because he actually let me do the takeoff and make sure that I was going to be safe. And there I am trimming, which you also don't do like that in the B-1. So it was a little bit of work to teach me how to fly this airplane, but it was a lot of fun. I felt very fortunate to be able to do that. Also, just real quick on a side note with flying in the Air Force, we have call signs, and you've probably heard that from some folks. And if you've seen Top Gun, you know call signs from that movie, right? You hear about the fighter pilots. Well, we have them in the bomber community as well. And when I was at the Air Force Academy, as we talked about earlier, during my freshman to sophomore year, we changed organizations to a different squadron. And one of the upperclassmen thought it'd be really neat to come up with a call sign for me. So I'll spare you the details, but the bottom line is after some not so good options like Atomic, they decided to call me Nuke Jr. And then the junior fell away and I was Nuke for 30 years in my 30-year career, which is unusual because normally you have to earn a call sign, but let's just say it was meant to be. So Nuke. Let's talk about Granddad real quick. For those of you that don't know his background, all he ever wanted to do was fly. That was his passion, to fly. So at 12 years old, his father was running a supply kind of outfit that supplied confectioners, candies, those kinds of things to grocery stores. And in this particular case, in this particular day, they were going to be debuting a new candy bar called the Baby Ruth. So you can figure how long ago this was because my grandfather was 12. So you can do the math. The Doug Davies, who was a Barnstormer pilot, was flying this Waco 9 in the upper right. You can see a photo of a Waco 9. I don't know if that was his, but a Waco 9 type airplane. And he did this very often. And quite often he would fly this airplane and do promotional events. And so he got with my great grandfather, and they decided they were going to do this event over a stadium, and it was this racetrack throwing out candy bars. But of course, he can't do it by himself. So my grandfather, 12 years old, more or less begged his father to let him do this, and he said no. But then Enola Gay, his mother, weighed in, and they found a way to make it work. And he was able to put the little parachutes on the candy bars, help with that, and then fly in the airplane and drop them out over this racetrack, which I think is kind of neat. And this was his quote, which is a direct quote from my grandfather. I was thus introduced to flying, a delightfully incurable disease from which I have never recovered. And that is certainly true of Paul Tibbets Jr. After that, he decided to quit college at the chagrin, I don't know what the right term is. His father wasn't happy. And so, but he decided, I want to be a pilot and I want to do it in the Army Air Corps. So he quit college and went to pilot training. Everything my grandfather did, he did well. He was number one in his class, and he chose bombers because bombers are, in his words, an aircraft where you can take the fight to the enemy. And that's what he wanted to do. And so he entered the war. And I'm just going to talk a little bit about his time in the B-17. This was the time kind of leading up to the transition to the Manhattan Project, and we'll get to all that later. But first of all, he had to kind of make a name for himself. So that picture in the upper right of the slide there is his B-17, the Red Gremlin, which was the B-17 that he flew during the major part of the early part of this war. So many of you know some of these stories, but I think it's important to just kind of visit them real quick. Everybody knows my grandfather if they know him. Of course, when they were told, they go, "Oh yeah, he's the one that flew the Enola Gay." Right. But how did we get there? Well, this is a huge, huge step towards that direction when he was chosen to lead the initial daylight raid by an American squadron when Germany occupied Europe. This was a big deal. Rouen was a target. There's been a lot of books written about it. This is very early in the war. There were 12 aircraft that flew directly over the target. I'm going to look at my notes to make sure I tell you exactly correctly. And a few that were a diversionary tactic that flew. And they actually had Spitfires that were providing protection to them from the Royal Air Force, which I thought was interesting. His co-pilot was Frank Armstrong. I don't know if you remember that name or know that name. I always say from 12 O'Clock High, because when I was in the Air Force, that was a movie that we all had to watch that was it's kind of a mentoring thing to teach us about leadership. And so if you haven't seen 12 O'Clock High, it's a very good movie. My grandfather's has a part in that too, not by name, but he has a role in that movie. Colonel Frank Armstrong was his co-pilot. And then the second formation was led by this gentleman called Brigadier General Ira Eaker. I'm sure you've all heard of him, the commander of 8th Bomber Command, who is normally credited with this mission, unless you read my grandfather's book, because he will tell you, yes, General Eaker was on board, Colonel Armstrong was on board, but Paul Tibbets, is the one that planned the entire thing, right? He was the planner. He's the one that executed. He led the lead ship. And I'll come back to the kind of success in the drop bombs. I'll talk about that in a little bit, but let me just kind of keep laying the groundwork with you first. And then Lil comes next. So again, we're in the fall of 42. This was a big deal. I've got most of the important information on the slide, but I mean, you've got 108 aircraft, only 69 reached the target because the rest of them were either shot down or had to abort. This is the realities of war at this time. We had B-24s in there as well as B-17s. And as my grandfather said, this is the first time the Germans really took notice. You got these large formations that are out there flying together. And he said it was difficult, very difficult to figure out how to form up and build, get the formation together and then fly the mission. As a matter of fact, later I'll mention this, but a lot of these tactics that were developed during this time were continued to be used throughout the war. And he was the one that developed a lot of these tactics. So clearly continuing to make a name for himself. And then there's Africa. So my grandfather's entire experience in 8th Air Force was 2 months, 2 whole months. I spent almost 30 years in 8th Air Force. He spent 2 months in 8th Air Force because then he left for Africa. And this was an important time because today we'd say he got FaceTime. Now, my grandfather didn't care about FaceTime. He didn't care about any of that. He just do his job to the best of his ability. But he ended up flying General Mark Clark to Gibraltar. Not an easy mission. And he describes that mission in detail in his book, and it's pretty fascinating. A little bit harrowing at times. But he was put in charge of that and flying him down there. And then kind of got a name for being as I quote, the best pilot in the Army Air Corps. We'll come back to that as well. And then he transitioned to Africa, and this is where he finished up his flying before he kind of moved on to we call it today staff work, which during the war they had staff work too. But this mission and the next one, I'll load both of these, are really important to Paul Tibbets as a leader because he flew down to Africa to set up a bombing operation with B-17s, but all he had was B-17s and aircrew. And so he actually met, and I love this story when he tells it, it's really interesting, but they had to find a way to make this work. So he met with Air Marshal Sir William Welsh, who was the commander of these components of the Royal Air Force at this time. And he said, "Hey, we're here with airplanes and air crews. What do you need?" And the Air Marshal said, "Well," and he said he pulled out a road map and pointed to Bizerte on the coast of Tunisia and said, "Hey, if you guys can put some bombs on that area, that'd be great." And so my grandfather's like, "Giddy up." So he worked with the locals there. I call them the locals, the Brits and the folks that were there, and got some bombs. He got fuel in 5-gallon jugs, as you can see on the slide here. And he said, and I quote, "I found out exactly how many 5-gallon cans were needed to fuel a B-17. And then in that same vein, he said, "But I don't remember anymore." When he wrote his book, he said, "I don't remember having it anymore." But that was how he made it work, right? And so after this happened, these missions happened. Word got back to President Roosevelt about these devastating raids in this part of the war. And so he ordered a field promotion for the commander of the B-17s in North Africa. Well, that was not my grandfather, of course, because he was a younger officer. That was actually Colonel Atkinson, Hamp Atkinson, who was my grandfather's group commander. And Colonel Atkinson was actually not well during this time. My grandfather said he was recovering from a prolonged illness. And so my grandfather was in charge of most of the operations and the planning and the flying of those operations. And so Hamp Atkinson, Colonel Atkinson told my grandfather, "Hey, if I'm getting promoted, you are too." And so he ordered a battlefield promotion from my grandfather from lieutenant colonel to colonel. However, and if you know this story, you know about this. The next assignment for my grandfather was to Algiers to this staff assignment, this planning assignment. I call it a staff assignment, but helping to plan the bombing missions. And Colonel Norstead at the time killed his promotion because he said, and I quote, "There's only going to be one colonel in operations, and I'm it." There's a whole nother story about Colonel Norstead. I don't have time to get into it right now, but if you want to talk about it later in Q&A, I'm happy to do that. The bottom line is, this time my grandfather's career was very formidable. This is when he kind of developed this being a leader, an aviator, and obviously that led to great things down the road. And so I'm going to continue talking about this and moving on past this time, but I wanted to make this point about Haltitude bombing because I'm going to come back to this in the second half of the presentation. So remember we talked about August 7th, 1942. We discussed that mission. 23,000 feet. The operation was considered a success as half of the bombs landed, and this is a loose term, in the target area. Loose. I'm not talking like a CEP. If you guys ever heard of CEP, circuit area probable, and were they close enough to do damage? We're just talking about close. Half of them were close, right? Now again, this is new, right? We had Norton bomb sights. We're just learning how to use them. A lot of new things, tactics are being developed, as we're talking about here. But accuracy improved, right, throughout the war. And so I'm not jumping ahead on you, but I do want to mention this because we're on this point. Little boy dropped from 31,000 feet, was within a few hundred feet of its intended A point. Yeah, that's kind of huge. Now, there's a lot to that story, but my grandfather was a big part of developing a lot of these tactics during this time. Glenn wanted me to make sure I didn't skip over anything important. So this is one of my grandfather's favorite photos. So this is, of course, him standing in front of the Enola Gay. But what I want to talk about here is his time in the B-17. So after Algiers, he left and was hired to, I call it ring out the B-29. That's not B-17, B-29. And the reason is because the Army Air Corps was having a lot of challenges with this highly advanced, highly sophisticated aircraft and trying to figure out how they could make it airworthy and get it out to the war. So engines were catching on fire. The airplanes were crashing. They were having hydraulic issues. They were having a lot of challenges with these airplanes. Now they were working through some of those, but it wasn't fast enough. So they said, Paul Tibbets, you're going back to the U.S. in the middle of the war, and we want you to be our test pilot for the B-29. So that's what he did, of course, because he was ordered to do so. And this is from the kind of summer of 43 to summer of 44. And so now we're picking up right where we left off. He went to Algiers in February of 43 after 6 months of combat time, both in England and then, of course, in Africa. And then went to Algiers, and then now here we are testing B-29s. He got a lot of time in the B-29. But one interesting story I want to share with you during this time. Most of the aircraft he was flying were fully equipped with all the armor plating and the guns, all the guns that were in the airplane. But one day he said the aircraft they were flying, primary aircraft, were down, and he borrowed an aircraft that was stripped of the armor and had no armament. And you might think, well, that's interesting. Why is that? Well, it just hadn't been completely outfitted yet. It was a sort of a test airplane. And that became a hidden gem for my grandfather, because what he found out flying that airplane up at altitude at 35,000 feet, one is without armament, it's about 7,000 pounds lighter. So hold that thought for a second. The other is when they got up to 30 to 35,000 feet, they were doing some tests with fighters, and he found out that he could turn inside the radius of a P-47. So as he was flying around, anytime an attacking P-47 came on, he would just turn tighter than them and it would spit them out, and they would continue on their way. So he calls it interesting experimental work that really came to a T one day when they were looking at what's going to happen later with the 509th Composite Group. And so I'm going to mention that now because it's a good time to mention it. But the scientists with the bomb said, hey, you need to be above 30,000 feet. The challenge in that was, as my grandfather knew from his time in testing the B-29, the heavier version is that it had a tendency to overheat at high altitudes and long flights. What was the mission he was going to fly? Going to be at high altitude. It was going to be a long flight. And in the thin air, the controls it was sluggish and hard to control the airplane. I'm going to talk about this later, but he had to do a pretty aggressive maneuver after he released the little boy to escape the effects of the bomb. So all this came together when he remembered, hey, if we strip the armor off and take the guns out and only leave the tail gun, we might be able to make this happen. So, when you think about my grandfather, you think about it's almost, like every time he's someplace, he's come up with a new tactic, a new way to do business. And his mind just worked that way. Because, people always say, what if it hadn't been your grandfather? I say, I don't know. But what I do know is that his mind was sharp. He was always thinking and always trying to figure out ways to make sure they were going to be successful. This is another example of that. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about his time as Glenn asked me to in the testing of the B-29. And then there's this famous painting here. So that's General Ent, the commander of 2nd Air Force, sitting at a desk with a B-29 in front of him. And that young whippersnapper with the green uniform is supposed to represent my grandfather. So let's talk about this time period. So uh, a lot of questions come up about, how did he get selected? I mean, he's testing B-29s for a year. He's out of the war, right? For all intents and purposes. And all of a sudden he's picked. So a couple of things I want to share with you that my grandfather used to talk about all the time. And one is they were looking for a certain pedigree. And so it was clear that my grandfather had the pedigree. One was familiarity with the airplane. I mean, obviously, testing the B-29 for a year, there's no one more familiar than he was. But maybe probably more important is, or equally important, is combat experience. And we've already talked about that. I mean, he had vast combat experience. Now, he'd been out of the war for a little bit, but he had a lot of combat experience before that. And then this idea that I just shared with you a minute ago, this, I'll call it like an independent operator, someone that can come up with ideas, come up with techniques, can work on their own, doesn't need to be supervised. Paul Tibbets. So you can see here that this is kind of coming together. Additionally, and I learned later, and he used to talk a little bit about this, they were considering multiple people for this role. So one of them, I talked about it earlier, Colonel Frank Armstrong. Now, he was a brigadier general at the time, and he probably would have been a good choice for this, but he hadn't flown a lot in bombers. Matter of fact, during the B-17 days, my grandfather was doing most of that work, even when he was working with Colonel Armstrong. My grandfather was doing most of the flying and most of the planning. And so probably not the best choice. And he was a senior leader. He was busy with other things. And the other one that I didn't really know a lot about, but Colonel Bim Wilson, later promoted to three-star, he ended up being, believe it or not, kind of the point man for my grandfather to make sure he had everything he needed to carry out his mission. So I think of it kind of like he worked for the Manhattan District. So Leslie Groves and those people, kind of more about making sure he had all the resources he needed to be successful. So that's what happened with Bim Wilson. So there you have it. My grandfather was selected, right? Some funny stories in that selection, but again, just for time, we'll kind of move on. Then we get into, okay, so what does he have to do at this point? Well, as you know, he's got to find a squadron, 393rd Bombardment Squadron, which is the one I ended up commanding years later in my career, which was one of the new outfitted B-29 squadrons in the U.S. And you got to have a place to go. Wendover Airfield. My grandfather said, it was one of the most desolate places I've ever been to, and it was perfect because nobody would have any idea what we're doing out there in the middle of the salt flats of Utah and Nevada. Just nothing there but this huge airfield. And he said I had the runways I needed, got the buildings we needed, and we were off and running. And then the other thing is security. So my grandfather discussed this quite a bit. He used to talk about it in his speeches and this idea of how do you make sure that your team, and this is some of his team members here, this is the crew of the Enola Gay, so I'll just leave that up as I talk, but how do you make sure your team, when you tell them, hey, you can't talk about this, really? How do you make sure they don't? And so I'll tell you one funny story. So he kicked everybody, as soon as they got there at Wendover, he brought in the crews, the support folks, everybody came in, about 1,500 folks. He sent them out on some, we call it leave today, but little time off, right? And when he did that, he took some of his security people dressed in plain clothes and put them at all the choke points. So the bus stations, the train stations, everywhere where somebody would go in order to go home. And he said, all I want you to do is, when you see one of these men in uniform, just chat them up, see if you can get them to talk. Well, guess what happened? Yeah, I'm part of something really special, something secretive. Oh yeah, what is it? Well, it's gonna, that. So that started happening. So anytime that happened, those individuals got the pleasure of returning to Wendover and seeing my grandfather. And what he would do, um, he's funny because he said, I'd bring him back in, I'd read him the riot act, I'd put him in house arrest in the jail. and then I'd leave them there for a while, and then I'd pull them out and tell them, if you do anything like that again, your career is over. You're going to be in prison for the rest of your life. And so he said that, and I'm going to read this. He said, the house arrest, jail, the threat of future action, jail again, were enough to throw the fear of God into just about everyone, but there always were a few, right? There's always one. And for those, and I just to not belabor it, he said, I would just send those folks to Alaska where they could talk to their heart's content to any polar bear or walrus they found willing to listen. And that pretty much solved the problem. The other way that he handled it was, oh, do you need me, Glenn?
No, Paul, I just want to emphasize one thing. The 509th was not just a few bomber crews, composite in the sense that it was self-supporting.
That's right.
What was the total, I don't know, population of the 509th?
Yeah, that's what I mentioned earlier, about 1,500. That was the total number.
1,500.
But Glenn's exactly right. He had everything you could think about that he needed, right? Which was kind of a sticking point at times. People are like, why do you get your own maintenance? Why do you get your own chow hall? Why do you get your own security? Why do you get your own armament folks? Why do you get your own C-20, C-24s? I can't remember what they had now, but why do you get all of your own stuff? And he didn't really have to explain it unless the senior leaders were asking, but there were a couple of times, I'll tell a story about General Davies here in a minute, that sort of drove that point home. But thank you, Glenn. Composite group. So yeah, just his 15 B-29s, that was the mission, right? But there was a lot of people there to support the mission. And oh, I know. They were also listening to phone calls during this time. And so my grandfather would just make it a point. Then we find out that one of the young men's wives were pregnant. He would make it a point to have someone go up and talk to him. As soon as he said that when he was on the phone, someone would walk up and go, "Hey, congratulations on your wife being pregnant." Well, it only took a few of those to drive the point home, right? Okay, somebody's listening. I need to behave myself, right? Okay, so moving on. Couple of neat stories that happened in this training time period with my grandfather as they're preparing to move to Tinian. One is, and I think this is really interesting. I mentioned about the accuracy of the bomb over Hiroshima and how that was a lot of work to get to that point. Well, my grandfather was regularly flying with the crews because he knew in his mind, not that he told them, that he was going to fly the first mission. And so he was also in charge of, he was the primary trainer for the pilots. And then he brought in his B-17 Navigator and Bombardier, who were the primary trainers for the Navigators and the Bombardiers. So his Red Gremlin crew, primary three, were part of the organization. So one day he's out flying with and Tom Farabee was the Bombardier and Dutch Van Kirk was the Navigator. He was out flying with Tom and Dutch, and they were just doing a training mission. And he noticed that Tom was missing, but it was random. Like sometimes it'd be, left, sometimes it'd be right, sometimes it'd be long, it'd be short. And my granddad's like, Tom, and Tom was a fantastic bombardier. And he's like, I don't understand what's going on. And so he actually said, Lewis was his co-pilot. He told Bob Lewis, he said, okay, you fly this and I want to watch Tom. And so they set up for the bomb run again. They came back around again. They were lining up. And Tom was getting ready to release the bomb. And when he did, he kind of stood up like this. And my grandfather yelled out, "That's it!" And he figured it out. So Farabee, like any other bombardier, as he said, with getting his eye closer to the sight, making sure he can see the best through the viewfinder. And what he was doing every time he did that, those small movements changed his perspective and then changed where the bomb went. And so my grandfather, of course, in his infinite wisdom, decided that they were going to and did build a little headrest to go on the Norden bomb site. So every time the bombardier put their head there, no matter where they were or where they moved or if they got up or sat down, every time they put their head against the headrest, same position every time. I thought that's pretty smart. That's pretty smart. The other thing he had to do was figure out the escape maneuver, as I mentioned earlier. And this was a big deal because the scientists said, one, it's got to be above 30,000 feet. Two, you got to be 8 miles away from the blast, in our estimation, to survive, and the airplane to survive and be able to live to tell another day. So, what he had to figure out was, how are we going to get to that point? Well, clearly, you're dropping a bomb and you're flying an airplane. Well, the bomb comes out, you're going the same, it's all going the same speed, right? The bomb's falling away, you're going this way. So that wasn't going to, their altitude wasn't going to fix the problem. They were only about 5 miles high when they released the weapon. And so what he determined, thinking it through with the scientists, was a slant range distance. They're going to have to be 8 miles slant range away from the bomb. Well, how do you get there? And that was this aggressive maneuver I mentioned to you. So, in my grandfather's words, he said, calculations convinced me the most effective maneuver would be a sharp turn, which means I always say they racked it up. They went into a hefty bank, 30 or 45 degrees of bank, and then to a slight descent to keep up their airspeed, because if you try to maintain that, you're just going to bleed off airspeed if you try to maintain altitude. So a slight descent and pulling to what we call the stick shaker for 155 degrees. So quite a bit of distance, a sharp turn of 155 degrees. So if you figure 180 is turning all the way around, it's not quite that far, right? Not just to the right 90, but 155. And that's what they figured out they needed to do to survive. And it worked. But clearly, as is anything else in this mission, everything had to be trained, right? Everybody had to understand the importance of it, and they had to do training over and over and over again. And this is how they worked it out. So pretty fascinating. The last thing I'll mention on training is Granddad said he worked out with General LeMay a deal where they could get the aircraft over enemy territory. Now, they're flying single aircraft or ones or twos at a time with these pumpkin bombs, but they're conventional, right? They don't have a nuclear package, of course, they're conventional. And so they're doing a few in there. And the reason he wanted to do it was he wanted the Japanese getting used to seeing daylight flights of just one or two or three bombers dropping one bomb, because they didn't care about one bomb, right? They didn't care. That was not a concern of theirs, because it wouldn't cause widespread damage and inflict a lot of damage and killings. So he said that was clearly very effective. We would call that just smart tactics, right? To try to train the Japanese, and that's exactly how they did it. And he put an R on the back of the airplane, which was reconnaissance, right? That wasn't even a bombing platform in that day. So kind of interesting. Okay, we're going to move on just for time, but if you've got questions on any of that, we'll address it. Now, I want to show you this video real quick. My daughter did this at the Savannah College of Art and Design because she wanted to tell a little bit about the story of the two Paul Tibbetses. So let me play this.
A short time ago, an American airplane dropped one bomb on Hiroshima and destroyed its usefulness to the enemy.
My great-grandfather, Paul Warfield Tibbets Jr., was the commander of the 509th Composite Group and piloted the Enola Gay on the mission over Hiroshima.
It would have been morally wrong if we'd have had that weapon and not used it and let 1 million more people die. Now, who's going to explain that one? It's a devastating thing. It came as a tremendous surprise. It shocked people. I would like to get the impression across that not only me, but all of the people involved with this, and even the United States war effort, was something that we felt was absolutely justified in light of the times that they were performed. I'll never change my mind on that.
And the legacy continued with my dad, Brigadier General Paul Tibbets, who also commanded the 509th Bomb Wing 73 years later.
So after the war, my grandfather was invited to meet with the president. President Truman had him to the Oval Office, and when my grandfather walked into the office, there was several other military members there that were meeting with the president. President Truman addressed the military leaders in front of him, and he thanked them for their service, for their accomplishments during the war. And then he turned and looked at my grandfather and he said, "So, Paul, what do you think?" My grandfather was initially stunned, and then after he realized, okay, he's asking me a question, he said, "Well, Mr. President, I think I did what I was supposed to do." And President Truman said, "You damn right you did, and I'm the one that sent you. If anybody gives you a hard time about it, you tell them to come talk to me."
And today, these weapons, as a part of a nuclear deterrent, are used every day to deter major world powers and ensure that the enormous loss of life experienced in World War II will never happen again. I am so proud to be a part of the Tibbets family legacy.
Super proud of my daughter. I thought she did a great job with that.
A short time ago,
Now I got to get past this slides.
an American
I tell you what, Paul, we said we'd take a quick break. Yeah, here we go.
And there it is.
Take down the share for a minute so we can
Okay.
see all the faces.
All right.
And we'll ask you to put it back on. So I'm enthralled by this, Paul. That's, super job. I
Thanks.
spend hours talking about your grandfather, as most people can. And that film there was just an incredible tribute from a young woman who obviously came to appreciate the situation. So just a quick pause to check in with our audience. We've had a lot of chat, but no particular questions. We're going to go into Paul IV's career now, but are there any questions so far on Paul Tibbets Jr. and what was presented?
Yeah, please do. Please raise your hand or speak up or wave your hand in front of here we go, Colin.
Now, I just wanted to say that my great uncle was a POW ever since the fall of the Philippines. And he and a bunch of the other POWs of the Japanese that I got to know before they died years ago firmly believed that if those bombs had not been dropped, they would not have survived Japanese captivity another year or 2 years for the blockade and all of this. So when people denigrated Paul Tibbets Jr., who I was lucky enough to know, when they denigrate the dropping of the atomic bombs, I just remind them that it's estimated that over 400,000 POWs from all the Commonwealth nations in the U.S. survived because those bombs were dropped.
Rick Weber, you had a comment.
I have a question. The picture that they showed of Paul Tibbets Jr., his crew was 11 guys. Excuse me. And I was curious if they were the 11 on and how many crew members were on the Enola Gay when it dropped the bomb? Because one of the things, they dropped some armament, so therefore they didn't need all their gunners. And I was just curious.
Yeah, that's a great question. When they modified the airplanes, he had all the guns except for the tail gun removed. So they only had the tail gun on the airplane. He actually had 2 scientists on board in addition to those 11. And their primary role was to make sure the bomb was going to be functional. But more importantly, interesting story. The day before the mission, my grandfather decided, because of some of the, I'll call them recent crashes, difficulties with the airplane, he realized, hey, if this airplane crashes on takeoff, we're gonna blow up Tinian, right? It's gonna be bad. These weapons don't have the safeguards we have in our nuclear weapons today. So if they had it armed on the ground and took off with it armed, that could be devastating. And so he decided the day prior that they would arm it airborne. And so the 2 scientists spent literally, and they will tell you, that next 24 hours prepping and training so that they would be confident that they could arm that bomb in flight, once they got away from the island. So that's kind of how that worked. Yeah, good question. Thanks.
So there's 13 then. There was 13
right.
on that trip.
Can you imagine today we have 2?
Which
we'll
what you're going to get into with.
We'll come to that.
So if there's no more,
There are. Brad
there-
Watchabaugh asks, who took the photos from the plane after the drop?
So another good question. I do have resources that'll describe exactly which airplane was doing what mission, what part of the mission. But the way it was set up, there was 3 aircraft with both missions. There's actually 4. So the primary aircraft, which of course was the Enola Gay, you saw that one. Then they had a weather ship that would fly over all the targets to determine if the weather was acceptable for the dropping, which it had to be visual. So that's really important. And the third is, we talked about the equipment, right? All the equipment that's going to record the effects of the bomb. And so there's an airplane that was loaded with equipment that will be dropped to record all the bomb effects. So those are the 3, I'll call them primary aircraft in the formation, if you will, but they weren't flying together. They were spread apart. And then there was a backup airplane available if something happened to the primary airplane. So a lot of thought went into this, right? About how to organize this, how to make sure they're going to be successful, think through contingencies, that kind of thing.
Mary Klepper.
Somebody asked, sorry, where is it?
That's Bob Lochner.
Yeah, about the invasion of Japan. I actually have a copy of it. Eyes only. Those are my eyes, though. And it's got all about here what the original plan was, how many men we would send in, how many planes we thought they had, and they had way more than we thought they did because they were moving away from kamikaze stuff. But what I can do is I don't think it's top secret anymore. I'll make a copy and shoot it to you, Todd. I'll email it to you if you like.
Very good. And I'll try and find it online and upload it here in the chat.
Yeah, you might be able to.
I'd volunteer. The best book on the topic is by Richard Frank, the noted Pacific War historian, called Operation Downfall. And it is very good read and bone chilling as to what it all would have been like had it happened. Do we have other questions, Todd? Do we see anybody else?
I see Barb Smith. I want you to, I could ask Barb's question for her.
Yeah, let's do that.
Well, I could, but then you wouldn't be able to enjoy the tremendous bubbly personality of Barb. I could do a Barb imitation. Oh, there she is.
Let's get Barb
There
on.
she is. Yeah.
Thank you so much for being here, sir. I
Barb.
wondered if you had ever met any of the USS Indianapolis survivors.
So I had the opportunity. My grandfather spoke to a couple of groups throughout the years after the war, doing book signings, and those kinds of things. And I remember one time that I think he had a visit at a place where there were a couple of those survivors there. And so I do remember that. I don't remember their names, but I remember that time and hearing their stories, which was absolutely fascinating. And there was a book too,
Many books
that I think he had, and that I got a copy of as well. It's probably back here on
very
my
good.
bookshelf. But yes, fascinating
another
stories.
question. So my cousin lived in Columbus, Ohio, and she attended the same that your step grandmother attended, Andrea.
Mhm.
And so she called me. She was kind enough to give me a call so I could meet this woman over the phone. And I asked her about meeting Paul Tibbets, her husband. And she says, yeah, I think I met him at a bar and he just kept talking about the war and kept talking about the war. And I said, stop talking about the war. It's over already. Do you have any recollection of anything like that?
No, I mean, I spent a little bit of time with Andrea, yeah, they met years later, right? Because he remarried in the mid 50s.
Yes.
So we used to share stories when I was up there every once in a while. Most of my time spent with my grandfather was on the road when he was doing book signings and those kinds of things. But yeah, we had a couple times to chat. But most of it was his life surrounded this, right? I mean, he ran executive jet aviation for 20 years, which is now NetJets. And then he put a book out, and that was the rest of his life, was talking about his experiences. And aren't we glad he did?
Yeah.
So,
Oh, thank you so much. And we visited Dutch Van Kirk's, the Navigator's gravesite in Northumberland, Pennsylvania, after we read his autobiography. And that autobiography is it's so interesting. It's just all about his letters home, back and forth to his
Right.
parents. It's quite a interesting read. Thank you so
Yeah.
much, sir, for your service and for your family's service.
well,
Thank you.
Thank you. And you're right. I have a copy of True Course, I think is the name of that book. I have a copy of that. And Dutch outlived my grandfather. The only primary crew member to outlive my grandfather was
Yes.
Dutch Van Kirk.
Yes.
And he was much older than the rest of them, by the way.
Yes.
So,
Yes. Thank you, sir.
Yeah, thank you.
Joe McCarthy, it's good to see you. I haven't seen you in a long time. Thank you
Yeah,
for joining us.
nice to be here. Apologize. Been busy working. I'm retired and couldn't miss tonight, though. This is a wonderful, fascinating presentation. General Tibbets, my hat's off to you. You really did well honoring your grandfather's memory, and thank you for your wonderful service. I just had a quick question about the escorts for your grandfather on his way to the bombing mission in Hiroshima. If you knew any of the details about that. And after that, I have a real quick personal question, personal to me, about my father was in the 91st station at Bassingbourn in England, and there were B-29s there. He had pictures in his scrapbook of B-29s. I haven't really heard why. And maybe you would shed some light on that. Thank you.
Ooh,
Yeah, I'm
never
really
heard of
curious
that.
about that latter
Yeah.
part. I don't.
Yeah.
Maybe some
Never
of the
heard
team here
that.
can speak to that. Your first question. All I really know is what I mentioned before. Now I do have the resource on the Silver Plate aircraft. It's over here, done by Dick Campbell, who spent basically the latter part of his life, the last 25 years of his life, collecting artifacts and producing the actual true resources, incredible amount of research about each airplane, who the crews were, what missions they flew, all of that. So I do have the resource, but what I have in my head is just what I mentioned before about the three aircraft, the weather aircraft, of course, which is super important, the aircraft dropping the instrumentation, which was key in the photographic aircraft, one that was supposed to capture the pictures, right, kind of of the bomb itself. So that's kind of what I know about that. But the other piece, I don't know. Does anybody know anything about that? That'd be interesting. No.
Never, Todd.
I'm very skeptical of that
Yeah.
there were ever B-29s in England during the war.
I'm not aware of that, but I would not be the one to ask. Probably Colin or one of these guys that researches this for a living, right?
No.
Nah.
Yeah, I don't think so. But especially if you think about my grandfather and what was going on after he left to return to the U.S., right? When they were just starting to test the B-29. If you think about it from that perspective, getting ready to send airplanes to the Pacific, I wouldn't know why they would have gone over there. I don't know.
How about we take one more question, Todd, because we've got the whole second half of this to go through with Paul. Robert Eisenhart, I had unmuted Robert because I saw him waving his hand. Robert, please ask your question. Well, you got to unmute, Robert. Todd, do you know how to unmute Robert, or he's got to do it, doesn't he? I asked him to unmute.
Oh, he is unmuted.
Yeah, so your audio is not coming through, Robert.
Yeah, well, could you put your question in the chat, Robert? Because the audio isn't working.
While we're waiting for that, has anybody noticed the picture behind me?
Oh yeah.
So that's not by accident. This is actually a painting my grandfather had commissioned when I was a captain. So the same time frame of when I had the privilege of flying with him in Fifi. He commissioned an artist over from England named Ronald Wong, who did a lot of aviation art to capture this idea of legacy. So the name of this is Legacy. This is the actual snapshot of it, but we had prints made, and it has a description underneath the picture that says Legacy and talks about my grandfather and, his time in the 509th and then my time in the 509th, and we both signed it on each side. So the Enola Gay's ghosted in the background on purpose, right? Representing the history. And the B-29 is clearly very prominent in the foreground representing today, right? So pretty cool.
Robert, did you were able to get your audio? No, not working, Robert. If you know how to use the chat, put your question in the chat. We'll be happy to ask it for you. So look, it is already almost 8 o'clock. And I know there's a great second half to this presentation tonight. If we can move on to that, Todd, is that okay?
That is okay. However, I have to say, I know who Bob Eisenhart is. He was the founder or leader of Wings Over Wendy's. If you've heard of that, remarkable organization that's probably been around for 25 years in Los Angeles County. That started with a group of World War II flyers that would meet at Wendy's, I think, every week and share stories. It's kind of they predate the Veterans Breakfast Club. They were doing it in Los Angeles and have for a long time had just a wonderful following. And I heard from Bob recently, and they're still active.
Oh,
and
wow.
I'm looking forward to connecting with them and having Bob come on and tell the story of Wings Over Wendy's.
That's fantastic.
Thank you. Thank you.
All right, Todd, thanks.
So, Paul, if you would put the presentation back up,
Okay.
and I'm gonna warn everybody right now because I know what's coming up. This is not going to stop at 8:30. Okay. This is going to go easy 8:45 to 9 o'clock. So just forewarned. Okay. And I think you'll find it equally as compelling as the first half of this was. Okay, Paul.
But if you need a bathroom break, please take one. The only person not allowed to take a bathroom break is me. because then you're gonna have to sit there and look at each other, and somebody's gonna have to tell jokes. I don't know if that's Todd or if that's Glenn, but somebody's gonna have to. All right, ladies and gentlemen, again, it's a pleasure to pick this back up and spend a few more minutes with you. You see the title here. We've talked about kind of what's coming up. So that's me when I was the wing commander in front of a B-2. Pretty cool photo, I thought. It reminds me of how little hair I had back then, or at least how I wore it. My wife, when I retired, said, "Hey, you need to like grow your hair out." So that's what I have now. This is grown out, I guess, although it's a lot more gray I'm noticing than that photo, or a bit more gray. Yeah, so I told you about the my call sign already, Nuke. We when we were in uniform on typically on Fridays, we would that name tag you see I have on was our like our official name tag. And then on Fridays, because it's all Velcro in a flight suit, right? We would take that name tag off and then put one on with our call sign on it. And it would usually be a spirited name tag attached to the squadron. For example, I was in the 383rd Bomb Squadron, so it was Tiger Stripe because we're the Tiger Squadron. So but that was only on Fridays, not during the week, right? You gotta have the right stuff on. All of our friends and other squadrons and other important career fields would like, how come you guys get to do that? I'm like, well, I don't think I want to go down that road, so we're just going to leave that one alone. But it was fun showing some of that spirit, right? And that esprit de corps was a lot of fun. Let's talk a little bit about the B-2. So just a couple slides here. I want to talk about this idea of effects-based targeting, effects-based operations. Well, let's call it air power because that just built in. I didn't know it was coming. There it is. This is a palace over in Iraq, so this is from that time frame. And what the arrows are pointing to are the targets. So this was being used by the adversary for communications facility, communications node. And so as you can appreciate, certainly from dating back from the World War II timeframe, we're dropping bombs, but we're more or less carpet bombing, right? And trying to get the effect we need. Well, we are very fortunate today to have weapons that I'll say afford us the opportunity to minimize not only damage in general, but collateral damage, and to strike a target with a pinpoint accuracy. So at this time, the B-2 was carrying 2,000-pound bombs with a tail kit on the back called the weapon's called a JDAM. It's a GPS tail kit built by Boeing. And so the bomb itself is a traditional, I mean, you can go all the way back to World War II. Traditional gravity bomb, right? Just a regular bomb. But we take the fins, the fixed fins off the back, and we throw a tail kit on there that the fins move. And they are moving in response to coordinates that the bomb is programmed to strike through GPS. It's fascinating. So if you haven't heard this before, I mean, and many times people will ask, well, that's got to be really expensive. And I go, well, this is not a laser guided munition. Those are super expensive, upwards of $1 million or more for a laser guided munition. And that requires a laser, of course, to be on the target. And then the bomb, it hones onto the laser. Now, very accurate, of course. I mean, wherever that laser is, that bomb's going to strike. These weapons are just about as accurate, but they're about $20,000 a pop. So a lot of bang, I would say no pun intended, a lot of bang for your buck. Come on, Todd, you can laugh. So we're carrying 16 of these in the B-2 at this time, 8 in each bay of these 2,000-pound GPS-guided munitions. And so when it leaves the airplane, there's an antenna on the back. It locks onto satellites, and it guides it to the target based on the coordinates that are in the airplane. So now you know how that works. So that's what we're trying to strike. That's post-strike. So see the little tiny holes? Trust me, where the arrows are pointing, that's what's there, right? So the building's still there, right? Nothing's wrong with the building. And then you see what happened on the inside. So this is all about fusing, right? It's all about what type of fuse you use. When's a bomb gun explode? What's the destruction? What's the effect you're looking for? This technology has now been around for a little while, but I wanted to give you a sense of just what your strike forces today have available to them. And Midnight Hammer, we'll come to that in a minute. No different. GPS guided munition, believe it or not. 30,000 pounds, but GPS guided munition. So we'll come to that in a minute. So just to give you a visual of this, now this is Whiteman Air Force Base. We're not blowing up Whiteman, but if one B-2 flies over Whiteman and drops these 16 bombs, this is what it could look like. So if you need to destroy a runway, that's a pretty good way to do it, right? One aircraft, 16 bombs, that precise. By the way, The actual accuracy is classified, but we always say it's less than a dozen. How's that? Feet. So very, very accurate. Since that time, we've also built a 500-pound version of that weapon, which is what many of the bombs being dropped in World War II were, 500-pounders. And that looks something like this. So a 1B2, again, dropping 80 500-pounders, and this is what it looks like. I have to stop talking because I think it's more dramatic effect, right? So incredible technology, incredible technology. So I always say that we're just fortunate because we have this technology, right? And we're able to use these weapons to get the desired effects that ultimately the commander in chief needs. But most of the time, you know, the folks carrying out the orders are the combatant commanders, the 4-stars out in the theaters, whether it's in Europe or the Pacific, wherever they are. We have a warfighter 4-star that's in charge of that area. I want to tell you now to transition a little bit, again, still talking about modern warfare, about a non-traditional way to use something like a B-1 bomber. So Bone 1-1, this is over in Afghanistan. This B-1, at the time, we were flying, and this is during Operation Enduring Freedom and Iraqi Freedom. We had one B-1 airborne 24/7 every day. They were deploying out of a base called Al Udeid Air Base, if you've heard of that term before, over in Qatar. And we had enough B-1s there to make sure that we had one airborne all the time. And so there's a transit time too. So obviously one's coming out, one's coming back. But we always have one on station at any one time with various bomb loads on board. But we were there to provide multiple different types of missions. One was called Armed Overwatch. So that's where the aircraft is flying overhead and it's providing protection for the troops on the, all these have to do with the troops on the ground, but this is providing protection for the troops on the ground. And this one was a combined improvised explosive device attack. And we were providing armed overwatch during that time. Now there was cloud cover, so we couldn't see the ground. We have a pod on the airplane. It's literally looks kind of like a cylindrical pod that you can put on the airplane, but it's on the right-hand side of the B1. Believe it or not, on the hard points on the B1 that used to be used for weapons in the nuclear mission in the Cold War that were no longer being used. And so we put a sniper pod on there, which is infrared. It's IR sensor, so you can see visually, or IR, so infrared, so you can see at night, but you can't see through clouds. So because we couldn't see through the clouds, we were providing armed overwatch to deter the enemy. They can hear the airplanes. We weren't very high, in the 20,000 feet range, and they can hear the airplane flying. But the issue with this particular day was we had multiple wounded in action. So there had been an attack, as I mentioned, and they needed medevac, so medical evacuation, to come in and rescue the folks that were injured, but particularly the ones that were critically injured, because their lives were at risk if we didn't get them back and get them the medical treatment they needed. And I was actually on this flight, so kind of interesting. This ate up most of our 8 hours on station, which we were there in country for 8 hours. But because of, I think, multiple issues, one was the weather, one was the equipment capability, the folks on the ground couldn't communicate with their command and control elements. So the people that they would call to say, hey, we need to get medical evacuation in here. And so we actually provided a communication relay to the rescue forces and helped them get on site to rescue these folks. And the result was that the B-1 is credited, our crew was credited with saving at least 5 friendly lives. There was more there, but some of them were injured worse than others. And so just to give you a sense of a kind of a unique mission, I mean, who would have thought that we would have been a communication relay this day, right? And we were. Didn't drop a weapon, but we provided a critical service. Then I want to talk about my Finney flight. So there's a video I'm going to show here. This is a kinetic attack. So this is a video I actually got declassified. Most of these are classified, of us dropping some weapons over in Afghanistan. These were troops that were pinned down. So they were pinned down by the enemy, and they couldn't break free. They had tried some other ways to get the enemy to disperse. They couldn't get them to disperse. So our guys were pinned down, and they called us in to help, I'll say, free them up, if you will. So this is a video from the sniper pod of us employing some weapons to get our guys free and able to continue the mission. So watch in the center there. This is the pod, the video there, the target's in the center of those crosshairs. There it is again, now we're good. So that was employing some weapons that says to meet GCI, which is ground commander's intent. The intent in this case was to save our guys and get them away from the adversary so they could live to fight another day. So again, amazing technology, right? The things that we're able to do. And then I want to transition to the B-2. So, and there may be a lot of questions on this later. Let me see if I forgot anything on those. No, we're good. Okay. Operation Midnight Hammer. I love this photo. It took me a while to find one that wasn't grainy, but this is a very clear photo, and it gives you a real good picture of the size of this 30,000-pound weapon compared to the B-2. The B-2 is absolutely huge, right? It's 69 feet from nose to tail, 170 feet from wingtip to wingtip. And now you've got this massive ordnance penetrator we call a MOP. It's also called a GBU-57, which is the designation for the weapon when you see that on the slide. And this is what it looks like in comparison. So just incredible weapon. Most people I probably aren't aware that this weapon we've had for over a decade. So this technology, of course, is the GPS technology I mentioned before. The weapon was built for the B-2. For the B-2 bomber. The only one that can carry a 30,000-pound weapon like this. We can carry two of them. Our bomb bay capacity was 40,000 pounds total until we built this weapon. Then it instantly became 60,000 pounds because we got to be able to carry two of these, right? So a little bit of testing went in with that, but you get the point. And the weapon was built for the threat that we used it against in Iran. So we've known about this threat for some time. And we had some real experts come up with how to best get after these targets. And this is the weapon they developed to do that. So again, if you have questions on that part, you can ask me later. This is actually a video, there's no sound, of the MOP. And you can see it coming in there at the top. See it coming in straight in. Just as accurate as the weapons I spoke to earlier, right? Less than a dozen. And you see the fire at the bottom there. This is a conventional explosion. It's a conventional weapon. So now here's one from the top. So it gives you a picture again. You can look and see just how accurate it's supposed to be hitting right there at this intersection of those lines. It hits right there. Just incredible. So again, we've had this weapon for over a decade, and it's been in our inventory. So clearly when I was the wing commander at Whiteman, yes, I knew about it. And yes, we trained for it. And there it is. And you can program the fuse to explode just like you could on our other weapons. It could be an impact fuse, so when it hits the ground, it explodes. Or, more importantly for this weapon, it can go through several layers, and there's a timer in there to delay the explosion until it gets to where you need it to be. So that's what we call a delayed fuse. So that's how you get to underground facilities like the ones in Iran. There's a lot on this slide. You don't have to read all of it. That's not important. But I'll give you a sort of a laydown of what was happening for Operation Midnight Hammer. First, I should say this. The B-2 has been flying. I got into the B-2 program in 93. I started flying the B-2 in 95. I started flying in 97. We received our first B-2 at Whiteman Air Force Base in 93. It actually was first flew in 89, which is the year I graduated from the Air Force Academy. So just to give you a picture, this is not a young airplane at all, right? I mean, I'm old, so I know it's old. But very capable still today. And I'll come back to that in a minute. But just to give you a perspective of how long we've had this airplane. And since the airplane became operational, we clearly know that we're going to be flying what we call long duration missions, employing air power long distances over many, many thousands of miles. As a matter of fact, those videos that I just showed you with the B-1, those missions out of Al Udeid were around 13 to 15 hours. That's short. The mission that I flew in Operation Allied Force in 1999, when we were dealing with Slobodan Milosevic and Kosovo and Serbia and the activity going on over there that NATO ran, those missions, and I flew two of those, were 30 hours. That's a little bit more realistic of what you can expect from a bomber flying from home and back. So 30-hour mission now. And I'm sure you get this, but just make sure we don't miss it. The B-2 has a crew member, two crew members, and there's no spare. So There's 2 seats, 2 ejection seats, and 2 crew members. So those 2 crew members are responsible for that airplane for the entire length of the mission. In this case, we were talking about 30 hours. And so you might, how do you do that? Well, we can talk about that in Q&A if you want to talk about that, but it's challenging. It's very challenging, but we train for it. And people always say, what's impressive about our military? And I say a lot of things. But one of the things that's most impressive to me is the amount of time and effort and resources we put into training to make sure that when we're called to do our job, we're ready to go, right? And that's super, super important. I'm sure you can appreciate that. These missions were 36, 37 hours, so a little bit longer. They were from Whiteman and they returned to Whiteman. However, the difference in this particular this mission set is that, as you can see on the slide here, we had 7 B-2s, and we only have 20 B-2s total in the inventory. 7 B-2s airborne to do something like this is a lot. You've probably read some of the news about this, but the objective was to, and I'll read it here, to severely damage or destroy Iran's nuclear weapons infrastructure and degrade its nuclear program. And we use deception in this, which you've probably heard about, but if you haven't, it's pretty interesting, where we sent some B-2s the other direction to use as a decoy, and then kept these B-2s under minimal communications heading the other direction, right? Heading east to take care of these targets. So deception was a big part of this, and it did draw attention away from this particular strike because people were watching the other ones fly towards Guam. The aircraft themselves, I mentioned there's 7 B-2s, 30,000-pound bomb, GBU MOPS in each, 2 in each aircraft. And we also had submarine launched Tomahawks, and I'll mention that in a minute, but 125 total airplanes that were involved in this mission. So you see the 7 B-2s. The other aircraft, I think, are supposed to represent tankers, air refuelers. So as you know, or as you can appreciate, in order to fly for 30 hours, you're going to do multiple refuelings. I get the question all the time, how many? Well, it depends. But normally, in a mission this long, there's probably going to be 4 air refuelings round trip in order to keep the airplane with an adequate amount of gas, but also it still has to get to its combat altitude, right? So there's limits there. And then we have to maintain a certain amount of fuel if we were to need to divert. If we had an emergency and the airplane was going to need to land someplace, it can't land anywhere. It's a B-2. So we have designated landing spots. So we have minimum amount of gas to get to those landing spots. So it's very complicated. And let me just add this. So all the time people go, man, that was awesome. I go, yeah, it was. And let me tell you, it's hard. It's difficult. And what I mean by that, we make it look easy, right? You go, oh, B-2s went over there and didn't come back. Right. But those of us that have been in the military that understand that the training I just mentioned, there is a huge amount of effort that is put into planning this, making sure that everything is synchronized and executing it so that when it actually goes, just like my grandfather. As a matter of fact, I'll add this. He said his mission in the Enola Gay was the most boring flight he'd ever had. And that's not pejorative or insulting. His point was we trained and planned to such a degree that when we went, we were ready. Same thing here. So please don't miss that. A lot of work, a lot of effort, a lot of ingenuity goes into making something like this happen. And when you have 125 airplanes that are supporting this, it's massive. And you might say, well, what are those? Well, of course, the B-2s. I mean, we had an airstrike package with fighters. We had support aircraft to make sure that the enemy threats were diminished. You'll probably know this too, but the Israelis played a part in that to suppress the enemy air defenses. And so a lot of coordinated effort going on. Okay, back to the strike package. So these guys flew about 18 hours from Whiteman over to the strike area. And then they dropped a total of 14 MOPS because there's 7 airplanes and each has 2. So that every one of them dropped the weapons they had on board. And if you can see the slide here, at the top, those 3 little explosions, the little red ones there, the top is Fordo. That one they used 12 MOPS on. That was the one that was the most critical target. And so we had 12 MOPS total that went in there. And you might say, well, why do you need that many? Well, you saw the weapon. I mentioned about it penetrating, but it can only penetrate so far. So oftentimes we'll have one weapon that'll go in and basically clear the way for another. Right now, they clearly have to be extremely accurate to be able to do that, right? So, and they are, as we talked about before. 2 of them were used on Natan, so that's the 14. So that's the second one down. And the third one down is Esfahan. That's where the Tomahawk struck. So the unclassified number is over 75. I'm sorry, over 24 Tomahawks struck Esfahan on that particular target. So the third facility there on the chart. Yeah, so a lot going on in this mission. And then the B-2s turned around and went back home. So you think, oh man, yeah, you're done, right? You've done the mission. Well, yeah, but those two pilots got to make it all the way back home. And that's some of the bigger challenges, as you can appreciate. That adrenaline is gone, right? And now, and you can rest in the cockpit. So I often get questions, can you rest in the cockpit? The answer is yes. But it's hard, right? It's not like sleeping in your Tempur-Pedic at home. You're sleeping on the floor on a mattress pad. So it's not built for comfort. But these guys are professionals. I'm super proud of them. They did an exceptional job. And like I said, they make it look easy. And aren't we glad? I said, not my grandfather, I said, aren't we glad that they do, right? A lot of work goes into that. Okay, real quick, and then I got a couple more things here to talk about, and then we'll wrap it up. I can't leave you without talking about nuclear deterrence. So my grandfather started this, right? We released the genie with the end of World War II, and again, aren't we glad we did? But what would a world without nuclear weapons look like? Well, I mean, in essence, it would look like World War II. It could. Again, and that would be horrific. 60 to 80 million died, so 12 million over 6, 1 million over a month, 33,000 a day. I recognize this is just round numbers, so just, don't ask me, don't say that can't be real. Well, the numbers, the first number is real. The rest of it's just to give you an example of what it could look like. And we all know, I mean, we could list a lot, right? Pearl Harbor, Iwo Jima, Normandy, just destruction, death. And then in 1945, this level, war didn't stop, but this level of destruction stopped. And so I'll describe it this way. In Vietnam, we lost 1.3 million over 20 years, which was basically a month in World War II. So as an example of just how we could think about it today, every loss of life is critical. Every loss of life is devastating. But, we're deterring a couple of existential threats right now, maybe some others. You can make that argument. We don't have to do that tonight, but without a nuclear deterrent, where would we be? I would suggest to you, we would not be in as good a place as we are if we didn't have what I consider to be a foundational deterrence. Deterrence is foundational to our national security. We are able to do everything else that we do because we have a deterrent that underpins all of that, right? It keeps major superpowers at bay. I say it's the highest calling. Others have said that, but it's extremely important. We are upgrading all three legs of our nuclear triad right now. The B-2 is going to be replaced by the B-21, and it's already flying. I'm sure you've seen that on the news. The Minuteman III ICBM is being replaced by the Sentinel. That work is ongoing, and the Navy is replacing their submarine, and that work is ongoing. And so every president since Eisenhower, and you can quote me on that, party agnostic, politics agnostic, have agreed that this triad is foundational to our national security. So I'll leave it at that. Here's what Granddad said about it.
I believe that we're going to have to maintain a certain strength in nuclear weapons no matter what the case may be. So therefore, it will continue, I believe, to guarantee us the freedom of a major war that we've had for the past 40 some odd years, 45 years almost.
You're not one of those people that say total disarmament.
I do not agree in total disarmament by any stretch of the imagination. And I believe we have to have a strong position. We have to have the will to back that position up. And that will might cause some bloodshed. But still, the world has to know that we mean what we say in regard to maintaining a peaceful relationship with the rest of the world.
I thought that was brilliant. I will tell you that one of my main talking points is that we use nuclear weapons every day, right? Every day in a deterrent posture. And I think that the rest of that sort of speaks for itself. Okay, why we do what we do. And now we're going to talk about family now, right? We do what we do for the ones we love. And this is a picture of the 4 Pauls. So My grandfather, of course, and my father there have both passed away. My son, you'll see a picture of him in a minute. He's not that size now. But that's the only picture I have of the four of us together, believe it or not. Just kind of the way things happen sometimes. But at least I have this one. And Paul looks so cute there anyway, right? When we were going to name him Paul V, I told my grandfather was excited. My daughter's older. Her name is Avery, and he was excited. And you heard her earlier. She narrated that video that I showed you. And when she was coming out, my grandfather was excited about that. Hey, you're having your first kid. But when we told him we're having a boy, man, that was it. And I said, hey, and we're going to name him Paul V. And he looked at me kind of weird, like, I don't know, like. And I said, well, Brendan, I'm sure my parents talked to you, right, about naming me Paul IV. He goes, nope, they didn't. He said, and then he said, why you want to put all that on that poor boy? And I didn't get it at the time, but I get it now, right? After spending 30 years in the United States Air Force, I get it. Our families are everything, at least to me. That's my son now. You see what he looks like? A little bit older there. My daughter Avery. Now you can see her. This is at our 30th wedding anniversary. So my daughter and I put together a surprise 30th vow renewal and 30th wedding anniversary for my wife last year. So this is a photo from that. She didn't know everything about it. Unfortunately, a friend of ours wrote her a note and said, hey, I can't wait to be at your party. And that kind of ruined part of it. But we were able to get the dress sized appropriately. So that actually ended up being a win. But she didn't know where it was or any of the details or who was coming. It was fantastic. A great experience at our family. So I'm going to close with this video here. So this is narrated by, Air Force produced this. It's narrated by a spouse. And I think I'll just play it. Thought she did a great job with that. I was told, you heard her voice crack. I was told she did it in one take. Fascinating. I mean, just what our families do to support our careers. I'm seeing it now with older children, and I'll just say it's challenging. They went through a lot, and that was during their formative years, and it's tough. We always, as servicemen and women, get thanked for our careers. We forget that sometimes the biggest sacrifices come from the family. So that's it. I'll stop sharing and turn it over to you guys.
Wow, Paul, that was just excellent, which I knew it was going to be because I had the preview to it. So thank you so very much. My only concern is, should Todd and I be worried that the CIA is going to knock on our door sometime tonight and about
You're
all
safe.
Be worried about that JDAM coming in your window.
Yeah. You're safe. You're safe.
Well, let's move the questions. Todd, you want to start, or how do we want to go about this?
Yeah, I want to open it up for questions and comments here. Justin.
Well, mine's not so much a question, but thank you very much. It's absolutely excellent to hear a current day pilot, close enough current day, to say that the stick and rudder guy had a little bit more on him when he was flying that plane. It's always amazed me that I come from the stick and rudder era, and you guys are the joystick guys, and it's still flying. And thank you very much for your service.
Well, you as well, sir. Thank you. And you're right. Yeah, I flew a B-52, and that was a lot of work. That's all I'll say about that. So,
hey,
a lot of work.
It is amazing today that certain things have not left our inventory.
mm-hmm.
The B-52s, the 50 caliber machine gun, and the Chinook helicopter.
That's right.
For some reason, they go on and on and on in our world, which is a good thing that we do build good stuff.
Yeah.
Amen. Concur.
Right.
Well, there were a couple questions in the chat. I think Chuck Bartlett was asking this, and I think they're pretty obvious, and you kind of touched on them a bit. And that's, the stamina that it takes to be in that bomber for 30 or 37 hours. It's such a long time. And before you answer that, I would just relate that back to what your grandfather went through and the guys flying B-17s in unpressurized atmospheres at 30,000 or 25,000 feet. Although they weren't 30 some hours, it must have felt like 30 some hours. But so how these you at that time were a young man, these must have been sort of highly trained athletic warriors to be able to do that.
Yeah, thanks for the comparison, Glenn. I appreciate that. From the B-17 time, when this B-29 came out, and they're like, what? It's pressurized? That's pretty cool. Yes. So first of all, my opening comment would be it's a young man or young woman's game. When I came back as a wing commander, they asked me if I wanted to fly a long duration mission of sorts, and I'm like, absolutely not. No. I mean, that's for you guys, right? I'll do my job, which is really not to fly. It's to take care of the people who are flying, right? And the people who are supporting those efforts. That's my job as the wing commander. And it's very taxing. I mean, you see fitness is always a big thing for our servicemen and women. And you could see it no more clearly than an example like this, right? I mean, you have to be fit to be able to just withstand and be able to stay focused for that amount of time. Clearly, the human body can only take so much. So that's why there's the opportunity to take a nap. We do have a system set up with the flight docs and our trainers to prepare people for this. So you're not just jumping in and flying a mission. We actually do it in the simulator first, believe it or not, which is really painful because you're in a sim. But we do it in the simulator. We actually have medications that we can use to help people sleep, which is Ambien or Restoril or something like that, to make sure people get sleep before they go fly. And then we have we call them go pills. There's opportunity for those as well for folks that are tired, that need to stay awake. And so all of that is ground tested first. All of that is screened out with every aviator before they go fly. So there's no surprises when you get in the cockpit, right? You know what you're getting into. So you have these resources available to you to best maximize, the clear physiological challenges you're going to go through, right, over that time period you're flying. And I think it needs to be said that, it might be a 30-hour mission or a 36-hour mission, but you show at the squadron 6 hours prior to that. So you got to add those in. Then you still got to wake up, right? And so it's highly complex, right? And again, back to training. It's all about training and making sure our guys are prepared to go.
Excellent. Other questions? Anything in the chat, Todd, we ought to address?
Paul Little asked, would the general like to give an opinion on the Ukrainian situation? I don't know.
Really.
I mean,
it's horrible. I mean, I am retired now too, so certainly We all have our opinions on things, and what's happening. I remember when Ukraine gave up nuclear weapons. I remember that time frame. Maybe I'll just stop there.
Mhm.
Well, I'd ask a corollary to that, or a additional question is, the air war in the Ukraine on both sides is primarily being carried out by drones.
Yeah, that's right.
Drones that you could go down to, the local hardware store to buy.
That's right. Yep. And
What implication do you think that has on the evolution of modern warfare?
Well, drones are, so first of all, that's a great point. And they're also flying F-16s. We were helping them with the F-16s, but the drones are the primary asset that's being used right now. And we've seen the effect of those. It's an incredible weapon system in and of itself. They have their own limitations. Like I would hesitate to put nuclear weapons on a drone personally. I just don't think that's a good idea. But they are on Minuteman threes. That's a different kind of drone, right? That's an ICBM or an SLBM as opposed to an aircraft. But I think you're right, Glenn. It's changing warfare. If you read some of the things coming out right now on what our Air Force is doing, and the Navy's following suit as well, the program called Combat Collaborative Aircraft, where we are building a sort of a mothership, if you will, and drones that will be flying together, and sometimes in large numbers that can be controlled airborne. And so these drones we're talking about generally are just programmed to go to one target and strike that target, but there are other ways to do that as well. So warfare is changing. You're going to see in the future, you're still going to see manned aircraft, I believe, for some time. But I think what you might see is, some manned aircraft, and a lot of these wingmen that don't have a pilot in them. There's still a pilot controlling them, right? So that we shouldn't miss that point. Someone's still controlling them. But yeah, warfare is going to change, I think, a great deal in the future.
Yeah, well, we'll just leave it there because that could be a whole topic in and of itself.
That's right.
I wonder if we should address that in a program sometime, Glenn. Just, might make an interesting one.
Mhm.
What the future of warfare,
of air warfare.
Air warfare?
Yeah.
Well, I think it also impacts, I don't, these swarms of drones and that kind of thing you just mentioned there, Paul. I can't quite, what's that do to, the Navy in terms of its, the massive amounts of aircraft carriers and associated ships that we have out there? Does that change their mission? Does it change their role in defense, in offense, right? Hard to think that we build these multi-billion-dollar weapon systems that won't be able to be taken out by a swarm of, $100 drones.
Well, power projection is important, and defending power projection, defending those kinds of assets is really important, right? In order to survive something like that. So that's all of that. I think that'd be an interesting discussion for you guys to have in a future event. Get some of these experts that are involved in some of this, and there's several that I know too. I can help you with some of them, but I could see that being a great dialogue about the future of warfare and what does that mean, given the latest developments in technologies, and that'd be fun.
There's I'm sure the name. I'm going to stumble over how to pronounce his last name, but Admiral Stavridis.
Yes, I do. Actually, I worked with him a little bit when I was later in my career.
So he's turned to writing fiction books. Two of them one's called 2034 and one called 2054, and it's about sort of the future World War, if you will, and the technology associated with it. And I would highly recommend them. I'm dying to get him on our program. I've emailed him probably too many times. Sure, I've become a pest. But his books are fascinating.
Sounds like it. Dave Deptula is in a think tank that he runs, and they write a lot about this right now. So he might be a good one to have on your program at some point. I'll send it to you.
Yeah, please send that to me. I'd love it.
I will.
That'd be terrific. I thought I would share a picture of Pete Sarmiento, who's on our program tonight, Air Force veteran, with your grandfather, Paul. Pete sent this in an email to me. I just think it's such a great picture. Did you inherit your grandfather's wonderful hair?
Somehow I got the hair. Um, my father had hair too, right? So it's kind of funny. Yeah, that's a great picture. I appreciate you sharing that.
I wonder, your grandfather, I mean, really took on the role for decades of being one of the most important spokespersons of the American experience in World War II. Was that a role that he relished? I mean, did he ever get sick of it? I mean, people coming up to him all the time, his entire life, wanting to shake his hand, wanting to maybe challenge him, wanting to get a picture with him. I mean, was it something that it sounds like he didn't shy away from it.
No, I appreciate that question because I actually asked him that, and we had some conversations about it. I'll tell you something, then I'll tell you something funny. But he told me one time, he said, Paul, I had friends that convinced me, I'll put it that way, to put the book out. So that was a little bit of, kind of encouragement. We'll call it that. But he said, when I did, I realized this is, I'm a big part of this story.
Hmm.
And I would like to tell the story instead of somebody else telling the story. And I'm like, well, I get that. That makes sense to me. So he said, I will do what I can to get that story out there. Now, I wished he had put in a provision when he passed away to keep his book going because we've lost that now. I mean, I have the book, but it belongs to that other side of the family we were talking about, and um, it's for all intents and purposes it's dead. It's not out there anymore, and I am not able to get a hold of it to make it happen because they're not interested in that happening. So I think that's unfortunate. But someday maybe we'll see as we move along. But the Tibbets side of the family doesn't have any say in that on that piece, which is kind of unfortunate. The funny story is his hearing continued to get worse over time, and anybody that was around him knows that. So he told me, yeah, he goes, Paul, at some point, I can't even hear what people are saying anymore. So, I just got to do my thing and sign the books and I could see him I would be at book signings and I could see him in the zone, right? And there would be somebody next to him that say, he can't hear you,
Yeah.
somebody that's helping, right? So if you want to have them sign it to something, write it down on a piece of paper, right? That's what they would do. They get a piece of paper, for, Aunt June or whatever, right? That kind of thing.
I mean, because you could find wonderful footage of your grandfather in the mid 1950s on TV, on like the
Mhm.
NBC TV station,
Right.
What's My Line, maybe, or something like that,
Yep.
doing interviews, and he was at it for decades. We have monopolized so much of your time, Paul. We're really, really grateful for this. Thank you so much for
My
joining
pleasure.
us. Thank you, Colin, for bringing General Tibbets to us. Thank you, Glenn, for hosting the program. Thank you to all of you for hanging on for this extra long edition. Glenn, any final thoughts?
No, Paul, thank you so very much. I
My
knew from
pleasure.
the very beginning when we talked with Colin, this would be an extra special night, and it has been. I would like to promote our program for next Thursday, and kind of ironically, the subject of next Thursday is the Jeep.
The Jeep.
So
The
we're going to
Jeep.
go
The
from
history of the Jeep.
history
Yes.
of the Jeep, which has Pittsburgh roots, but we're going to go from nuclear
Cool.
weapons to the Jeep in 1 week. But I'm sure that will be just as interesting next week in its own way.
And I love Jim
Paul.
Blackwell says, great job, Nuke.
Thank you. Well, my pleasure, and thanks for having me. It's been a real honor, and hopefully some people were able to learn something tonight they haven't heard before, and I appreciate spending some time with all of you. My
Thank
pleasure.
you so much.